While the British were looking to pop music and television for inspiration, others had discovered an even bigger, untapped resource. British dominance of the theatre was once more about to be challenged by the Americans. One of the biggest entertainment corporations in the world had spotted a massive commercial opportunity.
Every musical on Broadway, virtually, almost every success you can think of, they're based on something. A book, a play, a movie, a historical incident or something. They're always based on something, almost always. The big difference between what we do and what other people have been doing is we are not turning films into musicals. We're taking musical films and expanding them for the stage.
The Lion King was the smash hit of 1999. And it wasn't just popular with the traditional Disney audience of children. With its groundbreaking use of puppetry and dynamic staging, it also impressed critics, initially sceptical about the ability of a film studio to do live theatre. Flushed with success, Disney looked for more films to adapt.
The obvious thing to put on Broadway is Mary Poppins. And it was early on that we figured out we, Disney, do not own the stage rights to Mary Poppins.
Fire! Light up the sky. It's the entertainment thrill of a lifetime.
Disney only owned the rights for the film version of the Mary Poppins books. Much to the annoyance of Disney chairman Michael Eisner, the rights to any stage adaptation had already been bought up by a rival, Cameron Mackintosh.
Michael, quite understandably, was slightly miffed in the nicest possible way that for some peculiar reason one of their greatest titles wasn't owned by him, lock, stock and barrel.
And so for a number of years there was a lot of argy-bargy back and forth with Cameron.
The standoff finally came to a head with the president of Disney Theatrical, Thomas Schumacher, flying in for an impromptu meeting with Cameron Mackintosh.
I said, you know, I know that everyone thinks Mary Poppins can't happen, but wouldn't it be good if we actually once just talked about what you wanted to do with it?
He wanted to know what I had in mind. I told him and he went, well, that's exactly the kind of show I have in mind.
And it was fantastic. He's the most engaged, plugged-in collaborator.
Disney have the ability, as I do, to do what we want. You know, and we were able, like old-fashioned showmen, to say, we want to do this, we don't want to do this, blah, blah. And I've had the dream relationship with them.
I'll tell you what, she seems so different, but I bet she's not.
Mary Poppins heralded a new era of transatlantic cooperation. To complement the Sherman Brothers songs from the film, a British songwriting duo were brought on board, George Stiles and Anthony Drew.
It was such a well-known story that we knew that we were going to have to tread very carefully. I said to George when we got the job, if we get this right, no one will know we've done anything. If we get it wrong, we're going to get the blame, because it's going to be our songs that are the least familiar parts of this whole experience for an audience member.
You're practically perfect in every way.
I guarantee.
Practically perfect. We hope you'll stay.
With the contribution of Stiles and Drew and the weight of Disney and Mackintosh behind it, Mary Poppins became an international hit. More Disney musicals are in the pipeline, reinforcing their position as major players in the industry. But their business model can all be traced back to one man.
Cameron changed the face of the theatrical industry in terms of musicals. Our success at Disney Theatrical we owe to the model that Cameron created with his mega hits, and his commitment to the role of the producer being all over the show and at the center of it with the creative team has allowed us to do things like Lion King around the world, Beauty and the Beast around the world, Aida around the world, Mary Poppins.
What the hell's wrong with expressing yourself? Being who you want to be. Oh, we'll join in.
Other film companies have now entered the market for musicals, Universal and DreamWorks. But the most successful British musical of recent years has come not from an American blockbuster, but from a low-budget British drama. One of those who fell in love with Stephen Daldry's Billy Elliot was Elton John.
I got a call from Stephen Daldry who said that Elton wanted to talk about this as a musical. To be quite honest, I kind of thought it was the worst idea in the world, but I thought, you know, Elton has asked to see me, I must go and see Elton. So Stephen and I flew over to New York to talk to him. The big surprise for me, because I always assumed that I would write the book, because I'd written the film, Elton turned around and said, no, you've got to write the lyrics. And I was really taken aback, terrified and thrilled at the same moment.
Billy Elliot told the story of a 12-year-old miner's son who dreams of becoming a ballet dancer. But transferring the story from film to stage had inherent difficulties.
Trying to find Billy was the most difficult thing of all. Because without an amazing child, you can't do anything. On the film, if they can't do a double pirouette, you just cut. But in this, we needed to find a boy who had the aptitude, at least to be able to learn if he couldn't do it already. And it was at that point where we kind of went, we're going to have to train these children.
Because of child labour laws, 3 children would need to be trained for each role. One of those playing the part of Billy was Liam Mower.
We had our first run through and we suddenly realised that Liam was at the side of the stage being sick because he was so exhausted, physically exhausted.
I was just in mid-pirouette and I just threw up everywhere. I literally projectile vomited. If you see the show, Billy never stops dancing. He's cartwheeling off pianos and backflipping and turning, and it's crazy.
But a couple of days later, we got the stamina to get through the show, and this happens with all the kids. That at first it's just really at the edge of what is physically possible for these kids to do. And I think that's what makes it exciting in the theatre, because you're actually seeing a real kid doing the same thing as the character is doing.
Billy Elliot also created another major challenge for the creative team. Set against a backdrop of the bitter miners' strike of 1984, this would be a gritty, very British story, quite different to the usual West End musical.
As much as I admire the Andre Lloyd Webber stuff, that's not what we wanted to make, and that had been done. It seemed that there was time to do something else, and the problem is dancing miners. How do you do dancing miners? This could be twee, it could be awful.
In desperation, the team looked back into the history of British musical theatre and came across the work of radical left-wing stage director Joan Littlewood.
Joan Littlewood's work at the Theatre Workshop was very much that thing of making a populist theatre, a politically engaged theatre, an emotionally accessible theatre, and a good night out at the same time. And when I realised that we were allowed to follow that tradition, it made complete sense of what to do. And I think that I felt very nervous about that because it hadn't really been done for a long time.
Solidarity, solidarity, solidarity forever. We're proud to be working class. Solidarity forever.
Billy Elliot opened in May 2005 to overwhelmingly positive reviews, becoming one of the greatest musical success stories of the last 10 years. Like many of its contemporaries, it benefited from its film and pop star credentials, but Billy Elliot also brought back a tradition of a musical where the story, not just the creators, were British. In 2006, Andre Lloyd Webber was also looking at film to attract an audience. But for his revival of The Sound of Music, he'd also come up with an idea that would draw on the power of television.
We knew we had to have a star to play Maria, and the real truthful thing is that we couldn't get that star at the time. We didn't have a star to play it, and then up came the idea of casting it in a TV show casting programme.
Next!
X Factor had explored the pop world very successfully, and Pop Idol before that. And I was intrigued by the idea of, could we apply the same principles into a completely new area, which was musical theatre.
Running across 8 weeks, How Do You Solve a Problem Like Maria was an audition process like no other, where the star would be chosen by the British public.
The public has a huge responsibility, it really does, because they could be taking some girl's career and her life and literally destroying it.
My fate was in the public's hands, and that was even more scary because, you know, I'd never been Miss Popular, and it was like, suddenly it was like Big Brother, and it was a popularity contest as well as a talent show.
That was the toughest song tonight, once again for you. Once again you nailed it, and once again I'm going to say she's the best person here. We all very much thought Connie Fisher was the one that we wanted to cast, and if we'd have been in a normal process, she would have absolutely been the one that we cast. But ultimately, it wasn't in our control.
And actually, if they ended up with someone that they didn't think was really up to the part, you know, they were the ones that were going to suffer. So, you know, there was real jeopardy, actually, in who would get through.
If we'd have had, shall we say, the John Sargent moment with regard to Strictly Come Dancing, and the audience just putting somebody back in and voting for them just for fun, the laugh would have been on us.
How do you solve a problem like Maria?
Whoever the public would finally vote for, accusations were quickly levelled at the show that it wasn't so much an audition process as a prime-time publicity stunt.
I remember Equity speaking out against it at the time and not approving. A lot of actors and actresses that had been in the business a long time publicly spoke out and thought that it was an appalling way to go.
How do you solve a problem like Maria?
I think I got swept around with my fellow actors disapproving of it, but I think we all eventually came round to it because, you know, that we could see that kids were getting a break that probably wouldn't have done in a general audition.
The girl the public have cast to be Maria von Trapp is Connie!
Winning a talent show like How Do You Solve a Problem Like Maria, whether you want to call it reality TV, or whether you want to call it a talent show, an open audition, whatever it was, that process completely changed my life.
Connie, you are Maria!
I think what it really did was that it created a new star for musical theatre. And we'd gone quite a few years since stars had been created by the theatre show. I mean, one had to go back to perhaps Michael Ball, one would argue was found in aspects of love.
The hills are alive with the sound of music.
The 7 million viewers who followed Connie's winning moment helped generate advance ticket sales of £10 million. With the BBC and Lloyd Webber both happy, more talent shows followed.
I think that those shows reinvigorated musical theatre and brought in a much bigger audience, a much wider audience, and brought in a much younger audience.
You're not just getting older people coming to see the show, you're getting 4, 5, 6-year-olds coming to see their first ever production.
When we did our market research in the early days, it was over 70% of the audience not just hadn't seen Sound of Music before, they hadn't been to the theatre before. So I thought its greatest achievement was changing the demographic and the audience profile of who went to the theatre. It was an incredible thing.
Today, the reality TV cast musical has, along with star-led and film-inspired shows, transformed the West End and brought a new audience to Theatreland. "65 years ago, the West End musical was trapped in a time warp of pre-war nostalgia. completely outclassed by the shows arriving from Broadway. Through phenomenal daring, prodigious talent and breathtaking ingenuity, it fought back to become a world leader. Today it is home to an industry worth over £1.5 billion a year. But what of its future?
I think the future of the British musical is always about the writers. The marvellous thing for Andrew and I is that our shows that we did nearly 30 years ago still have the ability to appeal to a completely contemporary audience. And that's because the basic writing is so marvellous.
Through the 80s and the early 90s, we created some extraordinary bits of theatre. We haven't done that for a while.
I suspect that at any moment in time you could have asked anyone where the future is going. Everyone would have thought, well, it's all going to fall off a cliff. And yet things rise up and happen.
It's becoming a hotbed again, I think, the West End.
I think really interesting people are being drawn again into writing musicals, and that makes me very excited.
Today, the West End musical operates in a very different arena from the past. Its fortune tied up with other media and other countries. It now operates on a global scale.
I don't at the moment think of musicals in terms of whether they're British or not, because actually the musicals that are on in London, there are so many people from so many different countries. So I think one's just got to think of the future of musical theatre, not specifically the future of British musical theatre, because we're in an international world now.
Still to come here on